Hi everyone! For this lecture, we're going to cover two sections, ecological tolerance and natural disruptions to ecosystems. Ecological tolerance is the range of conditions that an organism can endure before injury or death results. These conditions that we're talking about are abiotic factors, non-living factors, and some of the common abiotic factors that we're going to discuss are temperature, salinity, which is the saltiness of water, flow rate, which is the speed of the water's movement, and sunlight. Ecological tolerance is also called an organism's fundamental niche, which just means the area that an organism can survive based on these abiotic conditions. Within a species, each organism has a unique range of tolerance. The variation from one individual to the next is, of course, due to genetic diversity. On the whole, the ranges for these individuals of the same species will overlap. So we can think about a species as having a range of tolerance as well, because most of the individuals within a species will have similar ranges of tolerance. We're of course going to have some outliers, so some organisms can tolerate a little bit like lower pH, for example, or higher pH, but on the whole, our species is going to be happy within this similar range. There are three main zones of ecological tolerance. The first is the optimum range or optimal zone. So this is our zone in the center of our graph right here. And this is where organisms can survive, they can grow, they can reproduce. When we move away from the optimum range, we're entering the zone of stress or the zone of physiological stress where organisms can still survive, but they're not quite as happy. They're facing challenges like infertility, lack of growth, decreased activity, etc. So they are not quite as happy as they would be in the optimum range. So for example, if we're looking at fish, if the water temperature gets too low, many fish will become lethargic, their metabolism will be reduced, so in general, their activity is reduced. If the water gets too warm, that water actually holds less oxygen, so fish will move on to find colder areas, or we can see them like our fish in the upper right corner here. They can be seen gasping at the surface of the water to try and get more oxygen. So these fish, when temperature is too low or too high, they're not spending as much time trying to find a mate and reproduce. They're just trying to survive. Our final zone is the zone of intolerance. This is where organisms cannot survive, so we are not happy to be in this zone. If it's too hot, if there's no food, if it's too acidic, if it's too turbid, these organisms will not be able to survive in these areas. Specifically, let me give you a plant example. So if we're thinking about an aquatic plant and the water is too cloudy or too turbid, that is actually going to block sunlight from being able to make it to plants' leaves. Plants won't be able to perform photosynthesis and they won't be able to survive. So that's an example of an organism in their zone of intolerance. I told you that ecological tolerance is also called an organism's fundamental niche. This is just another definition for you to see, but a fundamental niche is establishing abiotic limitations to a species' range. So basically what you can see in this graph is our fish can survive in this certain area because it can withstand the salinity of that area and the temperature of that area. So because of its range of tolerance, this is the actual area of the water or the aquatic environment that this organism can survive in. Now, the fundamental niche is just looking at abiotic limitations. When we actually look at where organisms do live, we're looking at their realized niche. So this takes into account abiotic and biotic conditions. So for example, we've got our fish. It can survive in this range of salinity, this range of temperature. However, the fish don't actually make it to this upper portion of their range because their prey species, their range of tolerance, cannot quite tolerate that high salinity. So if there's no prey, our fish aren't going to live there. And we also don't see them at the extremes of their temperature tolerance because we see that parasites are more common in high temperatures. So even though our fish could live there because they can withstand that temperature, they don't move to those areas because of other biotic factors. So that's our realized niche. Since species are adapted to particular conditions, environmental changes can alter their distribution, or if these changes are really drastic, that can actually cause that species extinction. We'll spend a lot of time this year talking about human disruptions to the environment, but for this lecture, we're just focusing on natural disruptions. So natural disruptions or natural disturbances are natural events that disrupt the structure and or function of an ecosystem. So we can think of tornadoes, hurricanes, asteroids, forest fires, droughts. These are all examples, and we can think of many more examples. But the thing that you should know is that natural disturbances can be less than, equal to, or even greater than human disruptions. And then I'm going to define a couple of terms for you that we'll come back to throughout the year. Resistance is a measurement of how much a disturbance can affect flows of energy and matter in an ecosystem. And resilience is the rate at which an ecosystem returns to its original state after a disturbance. Ecosystems are constantly changing, and these changes can be classified based on their timing. So we have 3 different types of disruptions. The first one is periodic disruptions. These occur regularly. We can predict them. There are things like day and night cycles, tidal patterns, and seasonal variations. So what we can see over here is this is Shell Beach. We can see on the top that's high tide, on the bottom that's low tide, and these are disruptions that happen frequently, like daily. Then we have episodic disruptions, which occur somewhat regularly, so they're a lot less predictable than our periodic disruptions, but these are things like El Nino and La Nina, which are weather phenomenons that happen every 2 to 7 years, or precipitation cycles, which occur every 5 to 10 years. So in that situation, we've got periods where we have little rain, so droughts, and periods with lots of rain. The last classification is random disruptions. These have no regular pattern, and they're things like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and hurricanes. Over time, Earth's climate and sea level have naturally changed. The main causes of natural climate shifts are due to Milankovitch cycles, which are changes in Earth's orbit and tilt that cause the Earth to revolve slightly closer to or slightly further away from the sun. So when the Earth is revolving around the sun and it's closer to it, we see more intense solar radiation and periods of high temperatures. When the Earth revolves further away from the sun, when its orbit is further away from the sun, that's when we see periods of cooling. Things like ice ages would have occurred in the past because the solar radiation is less intense. The main cause of sea level rise and fall is the amount of glacial ice that exists on Earth's surface. So if we have more glaciers, we have lower sea levels because the water is stored as ice. If our glaciers are melting, we have higher sea levels because that water is released into the ocean. The evidence that we have for historical rises and falls of sea level are ice cores and marine fossils. So ice cores are actually just kind of tubes of ice that are drilled out from existing glaciers. And those ice cores are really cool because they trap air bubbles, so scientists can study the composition of air from the past. So for example, what they see is when we have, or they can look at these ice cores, find an area of it that has a high concentration of carbon dioxide, and this is likely a time period where the sea level was higher, because we know when we have higher carbon dioxide, that correlates with higher temperatures because carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. Marine fossils are also good evidence for sea level rise and fall because we find marine fossils in areas that are far away from our current shoreline. That suggests that in the past, the ocean actually extended further inland and was higher. The big idea with this is that major environmental changes, like changes in climate or changes in sea level, usually results in large changes to habitat. So what we see when we see rising sea levels is that will flood coastal areas and estuary habitats, and that can impact those organisms that live in that area. So these changes happen over thousands of years, but they impact coastlines and other biomes globally. Climate shifts and sea level rise affect several different things, the first being habitat loss. For example, when the sea level rises, that is going to take away from coastal habitats and estuary habitats. When that habitat is lost, we see changes in biodiversity and ecosystem structure. That means that if we've got organisms that are relying on these coastal habitats, if these coastal habitats are overtaken by rising sea levels, organisms may not survive, species may go extinct, or just the structure of that ecosystem is disturbed. Also, what we can see when we have these changes or natural disruptions is species can either migrate or they can become extinct. In general, we see wildlife engaging in short and long-term migration. One of the reasons for this migration is natural disruptions. So we see, for example, wildebeests. They migrate yearly and they follow rain patterns in the African savanna. So their migration is for these small natural disruptions, which are these rainfall or rainstorms. After a storm passes through, we have new grass growing, which is what these wildebeest consume for food. We can also see things in the ocean. Ocean species will move further north as our water temperature will warm, and we see birds migrating. Their breeding often even shifts earlier, or we've been seeing it shift earlier as insect hatching shifts earlier when the climate is warmer. And these are your practice FRQs. The first one is more of a written response. The last one is a chance for you to practice calculating percent change.